Good evening. Welcome to Old North Church and Historic Site. My name is Catherine Matthews, and I'm the Director of Education here at Old North. We are so happy to have you with us, whether you're here in person or you're joining us through the magic of live streaming. Here at Old North, we talk a lot about the concept of active citizenship. And we tell the stories of people like Paul Revere, like the people who held the two lanterns aloft, like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who transformed Old North into a symbol of liberty. And tonight, I'm really looking forward to learning more about Prince Hall, whose life is certainly an example of active citizenship. It is our pleasure and honor to be partnering with the Paul Revere House and Paul Revere Memorial Association on this program. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague from Paul Revere House, Robert Shimp.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad, as Catherine said, so many of you could join us both in person here. This is very exciting to have you all in the building, and of course, all of you watching and joining us at home virtually. As Catherine mentioned, my name is Robert Shimp, and I'm the Research and Adult Program Director here for the Paul Revere Memorial Association. Tonight marks the second in our series of 3 Lowell lectures on neighborhood biographies, exploring 3 important individuals with North End connections. We started with Thomas Hutchinson and his house being ransacked in 1765 with our first lecture, and today we stay in a similar time period, but move a few blocks away, literally here in the North End, to Old North Church, and of course tonight move characters to learn a lot more about Prince Hall. As we get started, I want to thank in particular the Lowell Institute, whose generous funding, of course, makes this series possible. I thank you as well to our joint sponsors this year, WGBH and the Forum Network, of course, Annie, filming today, the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, the North Bennett Street School, and tonight in particular, the Old North Church, for both Catherine and Nikki for hosting and giving us such a wonderful space for such a wonderful and important topic. For tonight's lecture, we're thrilled to have Manuel R. Pires, who is joined by Red T. Mitchell, to teach us about Prince Hall and his life and times. Hall is such a seminal figure in the Revolutionary era, forming the first Black Lodge of Freemasons in America, amongst many other things. But I think he's a figure in many cases who's sometimes largely known of to some extent, but not really known about. So we're so fortunate to be here tonight to learn about Prince Hall and Old North Church, where we're only literally about a 2-minute walk away from Prince Hall's final resting place, Copp's Hill Burying Ground, straight up Hull Street, right out the doors here at the end of the church. Just for a few housekeeping items before I formally introduce tonight's speakers. After the lecture, we will have time for some Q&A for those of you in-house. I'll try to run point on that so you can raise your hands. We'll try to convey the questions to the lecturers the best we can. If you're watching at home, Emily Holmes is monitoring the streams for us. So enter your questions into the chat on whatever source you're watching from. She'll send the questions over to me in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to everybody who submits one so long as time allows. If you're watching at home, and for everybody in the audience as well, you can also catch these lectures after tonight as well, as they live on GBH's YouTube and Facebook, and we'll cross-post certainly on the Paul Revere House accounts as well. So with that, let me formally introduce tonight's speakers. Manuel Pires is a lifelong resident of Boston and southeastern Massachusetts. He's a graduate of Northeastern University and Boston College, and he practices law specializing in immigration, civil, and criminal litigation. He's a member of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, where he is past member of Celestial Lodge number 2, past master, of Celestial Lodge number 2, and serves as advisor to the Grand Lodge on Legal Affairs. He is a member of the Historic Committee and chairman of African Lodge 459. Red T. Mitchell is a World War II veteran and graduate of Duquesne University. Prior to his retirement, He worked in the insurance industry for over 36 years. He is a member of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, where he is past master of Union Lodge Number 1 and served as past Grand Lecturer and is a member of the Historic Committee and chairman of the Education Committee. We welcome Manuel and Red tonight and are very much looking forward to this talk. So, over to you, Manuel.
Thank you, Dr. Shimp, and thank you to all of you for your interest in Prince Hall. I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, and have lived here since the age of 4. But before developing an interest in Masonry, I had never heard of Prince Hall, who lived right in my town and whose lodge met at the African Meeting House in Beacon Hill. I did not know of the accomplishments or the contributions of Prince Hall. After discovering Prince Hall, however, I began to realize that the civil rights movement really began with him. I learned of Prince Hall, the Patriot, the abolitionists, the educator, the organizer, the activists, and the critical role he played during the Revolution. Fortunately today, there's a growing interest and a healthy curiosity about this man, Prince Hall. Historians, Prince Hall Masons, scholars, and community leaders are now advocating for the recognition of Prince Hall as one of the founding fathers of this nation. In this presentation, I will introduce Prince Hall from a historical and personal perspective. It's important for us to learn accurate and complete history so that we appreciate not only the complexities of past experience generally, but also that we may specifically appreciate contributions that were made where obstacles made them almost impossible. I hope, after hearing of Prince Hall and his patriotic activities, accomplishments, and actions during the founding of our nation, you too will consider him one of our founding fathers. So who was this extraordinary man, Prince Hall? Here's what we know. Prince Hall was enslaved from 1749 to 1770. For 21 years, he was enslaved by William Hall, a Boston philanthropist and leather crafter. On April 9, 1770, 1 month after the Boston Massacre, William Hall decided to free Prince Hall. Some researchers have actually suggested that the Boston Massacre of March 5, 1770, where Crispus Attucks, a black man and the first martyr of the Revolution, was shot by British soldiers, actually may have been what motivated William Hall to free or to grant Prince Hall his freedom. William Hall stated in the manumission document that Prince Hall, quote, was no longer to be reckoned a slave, but has always been accounted a free man by us. So what do we know about the beginning of Prince Hall's life? What we do not know with certainty is where Prince Hall was born. There's no birth certificate for Prince Hall on record. This points to the real possibility that he was not born in Boston. In his adult life, Prince Hall at one time referred to England as home and also signed a petition, quote, from African blacks, which indicate he may have come from Africa. There are those who believe Prince Hall was born in Barbados, based on the writing of William Grimshaw, who was a past master of a black Masonic lodge in the District of Columbia. The information in that book, unfortunately, was found to be unreliable. Other authors pointed out inconsistencies and factual errors in the writing. There is, however, an interesting link to Barbados. Peter Faneuil, one of Boston's wealthiest merchants, was known to play a major role in human trafficking during the time of Prince Hall. It is known that many enslaved African children were trafficked from Africa to Barbados and from there to the colonies. Peter Faneuil is said to have been in the trade of trafficking enslaved children, and this is a matter of record. Because we know Prince Hall's date of birth, as will be discussed a little further, and we know the time period he was enslaved, which was when we know then his enslavement began when he was 11 years old. This leaves the question, could Prince Hall have been enslaved as an African child that was trafficked from Africa to Boston through Barbados? We don't know that answer, but we hope to someday have that answer. We know that Prince Hall was born, however, in 1738. We know this because in a deposition that took place in August 1807, Prince Hall described himself as a man of, quote, about 70 years. Dr. Jeremy Belknap, a close friend of Prince Hall, an abolitionist, minister, Harvard-educated historian, and founder of the Massachusetts Historical Society, wrote that Prince Hall was born in 1738. This information came from Prince Hall himself, who told Dr. Belknap in 1795 that he was then 57 years old. And finally, in its annual proceedings in 1906, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge stated conclusively that Prince Hall was born in 1738. Many believe, however, that Prince Hall's date of birth was 1735, based on death notices in the local newspapers. The death certificate lists a Boston newspaper as the informant of the death. This information on the death certificate came from the newspaper, whose accuracy may not have been known. The date of death on Prince Hall's tombstone is also incorrect. The date listed is December 7, 1807. The true date of death is December 4, 1807. December 7, 1807 was the date the notices appeared in 6 newspapers, and it was the date of his funeral. We know that Prince Hall was married 3 times. His first wife was Sarah Ritchie. They were married on November 2, 1763. His second wife was Flora Gibbs of Gloucester, who he married on August 22, 1770. His last wife was Zilpha Johnson, and their marriage took place on June 28, 1804. Now, what do we know about any children Prince Hall may have had? It is often said that Primus Hall was Prince Hall's son. This information comes from an application for a military pension presented by Primus Hall, where he states, quote, "My father's name was Prince Hall." Question we have is, which Prince Hall? There were at least 6 Prince Halls walking around Boston at that time. We do not believe that Primus Hall was our Prince Hall's son. We do know that Prince Hall and Primus knew each other and had interactions. Other than this military pension application, there exists no documentary evidence that Primus was our Prince Hall's son. There's one other logical reason to conclude that Primus was not the son of our Prince Hall, and this is my own conclusion. Primus Hall owned a house on Beacon Hill. We know that Prince Hall also owned a house on Beacon Hill. We know this because of tax records and references to his, quote, late dwelling house on Lendell's Lane, which is found in Prince Hall's obituary, which was published in several newspapers. The Boston Assessor's Office show that a Prince Hall was assessed poll taxes and real estate taxes. Although there were at least 6 other Prince Halls in and around Boston during that time, we are certain that the records mentioned in the Assessor's Office belonged to our Prince Hall. And this is because the record further has notations indicating that that Prince Hall was, quote, Negro Grand Master to the Lodge, quote, or he appears again, and there's a notation, quote, Freemason. Another time, there's a notation, Worshipful Grand Master. Now, at the same time, there exist tax records related to Prince Hall. So we are left with this question. Could Prince Hall, once enslaved, and his son both own homes at the same time, where during that period, in certain times, there were only approximately 14 black-owned properties listed in the tax records of Boston. Finally, Prince Hall was by all accounts wealthy. We have an account of his assets upon death in the probate courts. Prince Hall died relatively poor. We also have an account of his assets upon death. So where did Primus get his wealth from? Arguably not from Prince Hall. Once again, there were at least 6 Prince Halls walking around the Boston area during our Prince Hall's time. In fact, there were 2 other princes that were made Masons with our Prince Hall on March 6, 1775. The name Prince, like Caesar, Pharaoh, were common names for enslaved men, as were Cato, Cuff, and Pompey. Given all of this, it is very unlikely that Prince Hall was the father of Primus Hall. Another individual, however, we believe may have been Prince Hall's son. His name was Prince Africanus of Gloucester. This is based on baptismal records where the name of his mother and father appears on the record as Prince and Flora. And we know Prince Hall was married to Flora Gibbs from Gloucester, and their marriage, as we know, took place in 1770. And finally, it would seem fitting for Prince Hall to name his son Africanus. So before becoming a Mason, we have very little record of Prince Hall's activities other than the marriage records I've already mentioned, the manumission document, which I've already mentioned, and there was a writ for damages, or a civil lawsuit, brought by Prince Hall and his wife Flora in Gloucester in 1771. That's all that we have. However, after Prince Hall's manumission, on March 6, 1775, things would change. Prince Hall becomes a Mason. Now, what drew Prince Hall to Masonry? Well, he recognized that almost all of the men of influence in and around Boston were Masons. And he saw Freemasonry as a pathway to securing influence and a network of supporters for his cause. What were his causes? He was a relentless abolitionist, social activist, patriot, champion for the underserved, underrepresented, and the downtrodden. Prince Hall understood Masonry would be a major platform to help further these causes. He understood that if he wanted to be of any relevance in that time, in that place, he too should be a Mason. As stated, many of the influential Masons of the time were in the area were personally known to Prince Hall. One of them actually recommended Prince Hall's initiation into St. John's Lodge, one of the 2 oldest lodges in Massachusetts. That petition was denied. Prince Hall, however, he was not deterred. He then petitioned St. Andrew's Lodge. He was rejected again. The mere fact that Prince Hall had the recommendation to enter those 2 lodges speaks volumes of this man in a period where black men were enslaved and had no rights. Having been rejected by these 2 lodges, the only existing lodges in Massachusetts at the time, Prince Hall did not give up. He was still determined to become a Mason. So let's look closer at the time period when Prince Hall began his quest to become a Mason. During that period, Blacks, although they had been in the colonies for more than 100 years, they were still not permitted to legally assemble in groups. There were no established dates or events for blacks to acknowledge or celebrate its history together. The Boston Massacre was an event that gave blacks one of the first recognizable reasons to assemble and celebrate. This was because a black man, Crispus Attucks, was the first and one of the 5 men killed by the British in the massacre. So March 5, 1770 was the date of the Boston Massacre, and the date chosen for blacks to gather or plan events. Laws and traditions during that time frowned on conducting business on Sunday. March 5, 1775 was actually a Sunday. So a commemoration of the 5th anniversary of the Boston Massacre was planned on Monday, March 6, 1775. So for this activity, commemoration, Governor Joseph Warren was scheduled to make a speech at the Old South Church. There were to be 36 British soldiers at that location to watch over the activities. Benjamin Franklin, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock were in attendance. Joseph Warren gave his speech, and in the midst of all of the commemoration and activities and festivities, there was an incident between the colonists and the British soldiers. All of the soldiers were gathered in one place, and during this confusion, with all the British soldiers in the downtown area, Prince Hall and 14 of his companions were able to sneak off to Castle William Island in Boston Harbor undetected. At any point in time, getting 15 black men to Castle William Island was a difficult venture. Keep in mind that black people were not permitted to legally assemble in groups, and it was unlawful for black men to congregate in groups of more than 3. Black people in Boston were subjected to intensive surveillance and policing as enslavers sought to keep their human property from escaping. And I would venture to say this regulation was especially enforced at night. So, March 6, 1775, Prince Hall and his 14 companions were made Masons. This occurred in a military lodge attached to the 38th British Foot Infantry that operated under a charter granted by the Grand Lodge of Ireland. This lodge was called Irish Military Lodge Number 441. This military lodge held its meetings in a fort called Castle William at Castle William Island. The worshipful master of the Irish Military Lodge was John Batt, and it was he who made Prince Hall and his 14 companions Masons. They were the first black men initiated into a Masonic lodge in what is America. Prince Hall Freemasonry, therefore, is older than the United States of America, predating the Declaration of Independence and the subsequent formation of the United States. You may wonder, how did Prince Hall make a connection with this military lodge? Well, this military lodge had previously been stationed in the Caribbean islands of Antigua, Guadeloupe, and Martinique, and there were black men from these islands that were recruited and sent first to England, then to Nova Scotia, and then to the English colonies. One researcher has theorized that it is very probable that Prince Hall came to know some of these black soldiers, and this was the basis of contact with John Batt, who was the sergeant of that regiment. Okay, so in 1776, the Irish Military Lodge leaves Boston with its regiment, and it's shortly after the start of the American Revolution. Prince Hall and his companions, they were given a permit from the Grand Lodge of Ireland that allowed them to meet for Masonic funeral processions and a St. John's Day procession. So under that permit, African Lodge Number 1 was organized on July 3, 1776. Prince Hall was elected Worshipful Master, Boston Smith, senior warden, and Thomas Sanderson as junior warden. This permit from the Grand Lodge of Ireland did not allow African Lodge No. 1 to do any other Masonic work or take in any new members. Prince Hall would later apply to the Grand Lodge of England for a more complete warrant or charter. This request was granted on September 29, 1784, and established African Lodge No. 1, which would later become African Lodge No. 459. So what do we know about Prince Hall other than what I've already stated? Because we don't have a good picture of who Prince Hall is yet, but we begin to get a picture. We really do not begin to have this picture of who Prince Hall is until after he becomes a Mason. To get to know someone ordinarily, we would ask another person about the individual in question. So how was Prince Hall described? What did others in the community say about him? Luckily, we do have that information about Prince Hall. Prince Hall, in writings, was often referred to as, quote, a man of exceptional ability, and, quote, a man highly esteemed and trusted by the leaders of the patriotic cause in Boston. William Bentley wrote a description of Prince Hall as, quote, an African and a person of great influence among his color in Great Boston, being master of the African Lodge and the person to whom they refer with confidence their principal affairs. Charles F. Haywood, author of Minutemen and Mariners, True Tales of New England, describes an incident where Prince Hall was described as a tall, lean Negro of great dignity. He always carried himself with the air of one who ruled many. The description continues, stating, he was thought by some observers to be of royal African blood, descending from kingly ancestors, deeply respected by all of African descent. Dr. Jeremy Belknap, in a letter to Benjamin Rush of Philadelphia, states, Prince Hall is primus inter pares of the blacks in the town, clearly designating Prince Hall as the leader of the black community in Boston. For those who may not remember Latin or have forgotten your lessons, primus inter pares means first among equals. Prince Hall was, by all accounts, an influential, respected businessman and trusted leader, well known in the community, black and white. So we know how he was described and what others thought of him, but what did he actually do that has us talking about him here today? Well, 3 months after being made a Mason, Prince Hall presented a petition to John Hancock and Joseph Warren, who were heads of the Committee of Safety of the colonies. Now, this petition was presented to them by Prince Hall on behalf of free black men of Boston for permission to allow those free black men to join the then standing army. This petition was denied, but it would not be the last. On July 3rd, 1775, Prince Hall petitioned George Washington to permit black men to enlist in the Continental Army. And at this point, I'm going to have Red Mitchell paint the scene and talk to you a little bit about that.
Thank you so much, Brother Manny, as I call him. Brothers and sisters all, wherever dispersed. July the 4th, 1775, a massive event took place. Celebrations that finally there's going to become a new nation with justice and liberty for all. Two great men that you will hear more about. One, Prince Hall, that Brother Manny has told you all about him. But he later became known as Prince Hall, the Patriot. He also became known as Prince Hall the abolitionist. Because George Washington, on July the 4th of this big celebration, came up from Virginia to take command that was at the birthplace of the Continental Army, 20,000 men, to let the British, at that time with only 4,000 men, that we mean business, we're going to have a nation of our own. Now, George Washington, as Brother Manny had just told you, was reluctant about letting black men fight. And there was a meeting between them. Did Brother Washington change his mind? Let me read something from you, from the book 1776, that will tell you the story that is all unknown, and then Brother Manny will finish. That story is this. Like most Southerners, Washington did not want blacks in the Army and would soon issue orders saying that neither Negroes, boys unable to bear arms, nor old men were to be enlisted. By year's end, however, with new recruits urgently needed and numbers of free blacks wanting to serve, he would change his mind and in a landmark general order authorize their enlistments. By the close of summer, 6 months, with increasing losses from disease, desertions, and absence of one sort or another, his army was in serious decline. Spirits suffered. The patriotic fervor that had sent thousands, 20,000 or more, rushing to the scene in late April and May was hardly evident any longer. It was not just that the army was shrinking, it was due to disappear entirely in a matter of months, the troops having signed on to serve only until the end of the year. The Connecticut enlistments would be up even sooner. Just this one remark, George Washington, who felt himself as an English gentleman, never really thought there was going to be a war, that they were gentlemen and could work this thing out. In fact, it had been the common expectation that the rising of such an armed forces gathered outside of Boston would cause the British to think again and reach an accommodation. A short campaign had been anticipated by nearly everyone, including Washington, who had told his wife he would be home by fall. The Revolutionary War lasted 8 years. There was still too few tents, still a shortage of blankets and clothing, and no one had forgotten that winter was on the way. Farmers and soldiers knew about the weather. Weather could be the great determiner between failure and success, the great test of one's staying power. In truth, and we're almost finished, the situation was worse than they realized. And no one perceived this as clearly as Washington. Seeing things as they were, and not as they wished them to be, was one of his salient strengths. He knew how little money was at hand, and he understood, as no one did, that the difficulties of dealing with Congress. He knew how essential it was to the future effectiveness of the Army to break down regional differences and biases among the troops. George Washington had to make this great decision, because the British are now looking for him to hang him as a traitor. And the question is asked, did Black Lives Matter? Ask George Washington, and Brother Manny will now take over.
So at this point, George Washington realizes he needs those men. He needs those men that Prince Hall approached him and spoke to him about, and that this war could not be won without those men. So, the efforts of Prince Hall, this extraordinary man's efforts, resulted in black men comprising 25% of George Washington's army. There were black men participating in every major battle of the Revolution, including, not limited to, Yorktown, Valley Forge, and Monmouth. 1 in 4 of George Washington's soldiers were men of color. I was never taught this in civics class, history class. I was never taught this in school. From 1776 to 1783, more than 5,000 black men participated in the American Revolution as members of the Continental Army. These faceless and forgotten black men participated in every battle of the Revolution, and many were distinguished in battle with acts of heroism. Many were unknown soldiers, used assumed names, or were identified on muster rolls only by race. Today, I'm proud to know that 1 in 4 of the brave soldiers who sacrificed for the founding of this country looked like me. And this was all and only attributable to Prince Hall. Research by prominent historians and a joint resolution of our 98th Congress in 1984 resulted in Public Law 98-245. This gave us some answers to questions about the number of African Americans who fought with George Washington in the Revolutionary War and the abolishment of slavery in the North. We now also know that black men who enlisted in the Continental Army stayed active for the entire Revolutionary period. That's 8 years. And they did so because this was their only source of income. They didn't have farms to return to and businesses to go and run. Some of them didn't even have homes to return to. So they stayed and fought for this country. Contrast this to the dwindling army that George Washington had before the approach of Prince Hall, where there was low morale, no interest in actually engaging in battle, and wanting to be home on your farm with the family. So from 1776 to 1783, we know that more than 5,000 black men fought to help free this nation. These men were all led and inspired by Prince Hall. But it doesn't end there. Who has not heard of the glorious Massachusetts 54th Infantry? It's no surprise that the first Prince Hall Masonic military lodge attached to any military group was attached to the Massachusetts 54th. Who has not heard of the Buffalo Soldiers? The famous 10th Cavalry, the very one that saved Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders from being massacred at the Surge of San Juan Hill, had Prince Hall military lodge members that were formed in 1883 by the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Texas. So let's go back to Prince Hall himself. Was he a soldier in the Revolutionary War? Although we're unable to locate any records that show that our Prince Hall himself received any military pay or pension, there are 3 records of soldiers with that name, Prince Hall. Keep in mind the number of black men who were named Prince Hall, as previously discussed. It is said that Prince Hall headed a committee of freemen to George Washington's headquarters in Cambridge, as we've already alluded to join the Continental Army. We feel that what most likely happened was that Prince Hall used his influence rather than met with him personally. He used his influence in relationship with John Hancock and Paul Revere and Joseph Warren to communicate this request to George Washington. John Hancock and others knew that if the colonists did not use blacks in the Revolution, the British would. John Hancock is quoted to have said, quote, "Give them their freedom with their swords, for if we do not take them, the enemy probably will." We know that Prince Hall and John Hancock had a personal relationship. In fact, John Hancock was Prince Hall's client in Prince Hall's leather business. We know that Prince Hall had a personal relationship with Joseph Warren, who himself was considering giving Prince Hall the opportunity to create a separate lodge for black men. This didn't take place because while he was thinking about that, Dr. Warren was killed in Bunker Hill, at the Battle of Bunker Hill. We know that Prince Hall and Paul Revere had a personal relationship because Paul Revere, Joseph Warren, and John Hancock were all members of the same lodge, St. Andrew's Lodge. Again, as stated, there were 3 enlistment records of a Prince Hall during the Revolutionary War. One Prince Hall was from Dartmouth, and the other 2 from Medford. There is a connection between William Hall of Boston and the town of Medford. However, we still don't know for certain if the Prince Hall from Medford is our Prince Hall. The records available simply do not absolutely identify our Prince Hall as the serviceman mentioned. There is one reference from Prince Hall himself where he mentions the war. It's found in one of the charges he delivered to African Lodge, where he states, quote, "Whether there may be any so weak, or rather so foolish, as to say that because they were blacks, they would make their lodges or army too common or too cheap, sure, this was not our conduct in the late war. For then they march shoulder to shoulder, brother soldier and brother soldier to the field of battle. Let who will answer, he that despises a black man for the sake of his color reproaches his maker, and he hath resented it." End quote. So even if Prince Hall was not a soldier in the American Revolution, and I only say this because we cannot conclusively state that he was, he may very well had been, there's no doubt that he was a patriot. Keep in mind that not all patriots actually fought in the Revolution, and not all founding fathers were soldiers. Let's now talk a little bit about some of the activities Prince Hall engaged in after he became a Mason. On January 13, 1777, Prince Hall petitioned the Massachusetts legislature to free all enslaved people in Massachusetts. Prince Hall was recently described in the Atlantic Journal to be, quote, "the first American to publicly use the language of the Declaration of Independence for political purpose other than justifying war against Britain." In January 1777, just 6 months after the promulgation of the Declaration and nearly 3 years before Adams drafted the state constitution, Hall submitted a petition to the Massachusetts legislature, or General Court as it was styled, requesting emancipation, invoking the resonant phrases and founding truths of the Declaration itself, end quote. On March 2nd, 1784, Prince Hall petitioned the Grand Lodge of England for and received the only Masonic charter ever issued by the Mother Grand Lodge of the world to a Masonic group in North America. This, in itself, was a monumental event and a watershed moment in Freemason history, and it could be the subject of its own lecture or presentation. On November 26, 1786, Prince Hall offered Governor Bowdoin the services of the members of African Lodge No. 1 to keep the peace during Shays' Rebellion. On January 4, 1787, Prince Hall petitioned the legislature to support a, quote, "return to Africa" movement. This was to combat the difficulties in securing equal rights for free blacks and women in the city of Boston. We know that Prince Hall tirelessly fought for the education of black children, beginning immediately after his emancipation from slavery and the onset of his Masonic career. On October 17, 1787, Prince Hall petitioned the legislature for education of black children. He wrote in the petition that blacks were taxed as whites were, and that they were in compliance with their proportionate share of taxes, and as payers of their equal part, blacks were entitled to their proportionate share of educational privileges, but were not receiving such privileges from the free schools of Boston. The petition was ignored. In 1796, I'm just checking that date, Prince Hall again petitioned the 1786. Prince Hall again petitioned the selectmen of Boston to provide a school for black children. Although this petition was approved, there was no school provided. After repeated attempts with no success, Prince Hall began educating black children in his home on Beacon Hill, and later opened a school in the home of his friend, Pires Hall, also on Beacon Hill. Could this have been the first true public school in this country? The school was called African School. On May 1, 1799, Prince Hall petitioned the selectmen in the city of Boston to license a teacher for black children. The license was granted to a black man named Nestor Pendleton, but that license was conditioned on the fact that the school had to pay for his salary. So in my research, I found that initially the parents paid 12.5 cents per year for each student. Once more, in 1800, Prince Hall petitioned the school committee for school for blacks, as Pires Hall's home could no longer accommodate all of the children. There was no school provided. And after Prince Hall's death, the school grew to such an extent that it was moved to the basement of the African Baptist Church, today the African Meeting House on Beacon Hill, and later next door to the Abiel Smith School, named after a white philanthropist who left money in his will for the education of black children in Boston. The school later became a part of the school department, educating black and white children. I believe this was the first true Boston public school. Let's go back a little bit. In 1788, there were a group of Boston enslavers who were kidnapping free black people, boarding them on ships and taking them to other distant places, and there to be sold into enslavement. Prince Hall, knowing about this, submitted a petition to the Massachusetts legislature asking them to, quote, do us that justice that our present condition requires, and continued. This petition was then publicized in newspapers in Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania, and Vermont. Prince Hall's intellectual capacity was equal to his humanity and compassion. He taught himself how to read and write while still enslaved. The charges he delivered to African Lodge, his petitions, and the few writings he left behind are a testament to his genius and intellectual acumen. Prince Hall was an extraordinary man in every sense of the word. It has been said that before we had a king, there was a prince. To that, I respectfully add, before there was an NAACP, there was an African Lodge No. 1. Before there was an Urban League, there was an African Lodge, 459. It was on Prince Hall's shoulders that later stood civil rights leaders, religious leaders, political leaders, both in this country and abroad, including the late Congressman John Lewis and Nelson Mandela, proud Prince Hall Masons. These are the legacy of Prince Hall. I tried to present as much as possible about Prince Hall and his contributions in the formation of this nation. I invite you to see that Prince Hall helped to define this country's values in challenging principles of democracy, civil rights, and equality during the founding of this nation. He led the efforts to allow free black men the right to join the Revolutionary Army, and he was one of the first civil rights leaders in this nation and was instrumental in creating the first school organized by black citizens to educate African American children. These patriotic acts, I respectfully submit, make Prince Hall a founding father. In closing, I find it appropriate to quote from one of the sources of my research for this presentation. It's from a book called Black Square and Compasses by Joseph A. Wachs, Jr. In order to measure the greatness of Prince Hall, one must review the written documents left by him, his petitions to the Senate and the House of Representatives of Massachusetts, his letter book, and his charges to African Lodge. There has not been on the American Masonic scene or in the pages of its history so unique a black Freemason as Prince Hall. His lack of formal education, his bondage, and the racial conditions of the time merely enhanced the character of this outstanding individual. His many accomplishments must be viewed in this light, and his achievements in overcoming all of these handicaps and the abuses, mistreatment, and often viciousness that was heaped upon him, his lodge, and later the fraternity he founded, is more proof that Prince Hall was indeed the master. I hope you agree that Prince Hall, an unsung, forgotten patriot, deserves the recognition as one of the founding fathers of this country. And I thank you for your attention. Thank you. If I could just add one more point from the resolution of Congress passed in 1984. I want to read just a brief little section from it, if I can. It's really small, but I'll try. The Congress extends thanks to the descendants of free blacks and slaves who participated in the Revolution and acknowledges the contributions of these courageous men and women who, in aspiring to freedom, helped bring American independence and set in motion events that contributed to the attainment of equal rights for blacks, particularly in recent decades. Prince Hall was responsible for that. And that has to be the act of a founding father. Thank you.
So we certainly have time for Q&A here, and I have to thank you both so much for that. Manuel, that was terrific. One question I was considering there, I was wondering about what his education was at the end there. You referenced mostly self-taught while he was enslaved. I was wondering if, one, you could maybe speak to that, and two, through all of these petitions that we're seeing from Hall, of which there were clearly many throughout his life, do we see him using some of the moments of the revolution, like the Declaration of Independence or other sort of language used by, the so-called founding fathers of the period, using that language to then speak directly to them? Does that seem to come up for Hall in this period?
First, I'll answer your question about Prince Hall becoming literate. Prince Hall, like most enslaved who were granted the opportunity to become literate, did so by learning to read the Bible. And we believe that William Hall and his wife permitted Prince Hall to learn to read the Bible, and he did so in the evening when he wasn't engaged in chores of a servant. Regarding the petitions, these petitions are still available in the archives. What we see in those petitions are references to the Declaration of Independence. We see biblical references, and we see Masonic references for those who are versed in Masonry. This is what we see. In his charges, we see that Prince Hall is extremely religious and extremely intelligent. His charges, he quotes biblical references, historic references, names that one has to go back and look up and try to understand, where did this man learn this at that time? It's a true testament to his intellectual capacity.
So to that question, we have one coming online as well. Do do any letter books from Prince Hall survive, and or maybe can you speak again to some of the sources that we do know exist for Hall?
There is a letter book. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the Massachusetts Historical Society may have a copy of it on microfiche. We have copies of what's in the letter book at our records and archive at the Massachusetts Grand Lodge, and I believe also the the Prince Hall Grand Lodge. And I believe the Massachusetts Grand Lodge also has copies. I think Red Mitchell would want to add.
Just another source that's well known. Dr. William Bentley, who was a Harvard professor, spoke 10 languages. I'm going to use an expression, a running buddy of Prince Hall, where Prince Hall, the record shows, submitted his speeches and talks to Dr. Bentley. So here this self-educated man is meeting with one of the great educators and ministers of all time. And it's in William Bentley's diaries that he gives a description of Prince Hall being a tall, lean black man. So Brother Manny, these sources that he's given you, it's amazing how this self-taught man knew George Washington, John Hancock, Paul Revere. I wish I knew these guys like he did. Thank you.
No
They were
questions
all
from the gallery?
founding fathers, namely or not. So should Prince Hall be.
Any questions from the gallery? Oh, yes. We know about his profession and his work. Prince Hall had a leather crafting business on Water Street. Later on Beacon Street, he also was a caterer, and he was considered the best caterer in the area. There's an interesting description of a turtle feast that took place in Salem, and Prince Hall was asked to come and cater that event, and in that description, it is said that Prince Hall was the best at it. Now, in a second. No. And Red Mitchell is asking me to read something, but let me just finish, and then I'll do that. Thank you. So, the fact that Prince Hall, the probate documents didn't show him to be a wealthy man at his death doesn't really mean he wasn't wealthy at his death. That's what's in the probate document. He owned a home. He had 2 very successful businesses. There's a record of receipts from Prince Hall to John Hancock for drumheads used in the military. We know that John Hancock was his personal client. He was preparing all types of leather goods, and that was a very successful business, as was his catering business. There could be a number of reasons why the probate document didn't list all of his wealth, but we have no reason to believe that that he didn't have means. Let's put it that way, that he didn't have means. Now let's see. Oh, here's the description that Brother Red Mitchell wants me to read. As for a turtle feast, there was one outstanding expert, Prince Hall, a tall, lean Negro of great dignity. He always carried himself with the air of one who ruled many. Indeed, he did, for whenever a well-to-do person wished the best catering job in eastern Massachusetts, he sent word to Prince Hall in Boston.
wondering about the 25% that you're citing there, but how many of those men perhaps were enslaved at the time? How many of those were perhaps receiving their freedom or lack thereof after fighting in the war as well?
That's Red Mitchell's favorite question, so I'm going to let him answer.
Let me propose and ask this question to you. Why did Massachusetts, of all places, where Boston and Salem became the two richest cities in all of America due to the slave trade, why then did Massachusetts become the first of the newly formed nation to legally abolish slavery? How did that happen? You now here know, with the leadership of Prince Hall and what Brother Manny has told you here tonight, the quick phrase that might seem off base at first or utterly ridiculous, when you dive into it, you say, well, maybe not. The ridiculous statement, without the participation of black men and women, there'd be no 4th of July, and George Washington may have been hung by the British as a traitor, and it's all gone.
Who freed who? Who freed who? Who freed who?
As Brother Manny has said, who freed who?
These soldiers, some of whom were slaves, they weren't all free, were given guns. They were given weapons to go and fight the British. Well, after 8 years, they still had those weapons. And who freed who? They freed themselves. The Lendell's Lane, the addresses, the streets changed over the years, and I do not believe that what was then Lendell's Lane that we see in the writings actually still continues to exist today. There are a couple of houses that are marked, one of which Middleton's home, which was right after Prince Hall. It's part of the Black Heritage Trail, and it's up on Beacon Hill, and that is marked.
All right. Well, I think that's a wonderful place to draw the lecture to a close here. I'd like to ask you all to join me once again for thanking Manuel and Red. What a wonderful talk.
Good job.
Learned a lot. So also, thank you all for coming out tonight. We really appreciate you being here. Please consider joining us for our third and final lecture coming up in 2 weeks. Gretchen Grozier and Mary Smoyer from Boston Women's Heritage Trail will be lecturing on Pauline Agassiz Shaw, both streaming, and this final one will be back at the Paul Revere House. Thank you again to WGBH and Annie for making the streaming possible, and of course Catherine and Nikki here at Old North Church and the Lowell Institute for making this possible. Thank you all for coming out. Have a good night.
Good job, Brother Ray. Nice job. I'm proud of you.
Wow.
You did a good job.
Now I see all that research. You must be a lawyer.